He vanished after school. No one saw him leave. No one saw where he went. For 14 years his family lived in silence. Birthdays passed, rooms stayed untouched, and every knock at the door felt like it could be him, until one night he came back, soaking wet, older, but still holding the same keychain his father gave him the day he disappeared. And when his mother opened the door, he whispered just 2 words, "It's me." But what he said next wasn't a reunion. It was a warning. But before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I read every one. The rain had been falling over Portland for 3 days straight, the kind of steady, cold drizzle that soaked into your clothes and made the air taste faintly of metal. On the corner of Hawthorne and 39th, streetlights buzzed with a soft hum, casting small halos on the wet pavement. In the glow, the rain looked almost silver, sliding down in perfect threads. Margaret Miller stood at her kitchen window, both hands wrapped around a chipped blue coffee mug, though she hadn't taken a sip in over 20 minutes. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but she barely noticed. Outside, the wind moved the bare branches of the maple tree in the front yard, the same tree Ethan used to climb when he was a boy. It creaked in the wind, a sound that always made her chest tighten, as if the wood itself remembered. She wasn't expecting anyone. It was late. The kind of late when the neighborhood fell silent except for the occasional passing car hissing through puddles. Margaret's mind had been drifting, as it often did, back to that Thursday in November 14 years ago, the day her son vanished. In her memory it was brighter. The sky had been crisp and blue, the air filled with the smell of wet leaves and gasoline from the school buses lined up along the curb. She remembered standing at the kitchen counter, slicing apples for a pie, when the phone rang. It was the school secretary. Polite, professional, voice just a little uneasy, asking if Ethan had gone home early. He hadn't. By the time the sun went down, panic had already settled into her bones. She blinked now, dragging herself back to the present, and noticed how quiet the house had become. The television in the living room was still on, flickering images of a late-night news anchor mouthing silent words. She'd muted it hours earlier. Somewhere upstairs the old floorboards groaned as the house shifted with the wind. Then came the knock. It was sharp, sudden. 3 short raps against the wood of the front door. Margaret froze. Visitors didn't come this late. She set the coffee mug on the windowsill, her hand trembling slightly. For a moment she thought about ignoring it, pretending she hadn't heard. But something about the rhythm of the knock made her skin prickle. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't hesitant. It was deliberate. She stepped toward the door, her bare feet soundless against the hardwood floor. The house seemed to hold its breath with her. She paused just before the door, staring at the frosted glass panel. Through the blur, she could make out the dark silhouette of someone standing on the porch. Her mind flicked through possibilities. A neighbor, a stranger, maybe someone selling something, but there was something in the posture, the stillness, that made her heartbeat quicken. She turned the deadbolt slowly. The metallic click sounded far too loud in the quiet. Then she unlatched the chain and pulled the door open just enough for the porch light to spill across the figure outside. At first, she didn't recognize him. He stood there in the rain, water dripping from the hood of his jacket, his face pale and sharp under the yellow light. His eyes, deep brown, the same shade as her own, locked onto hers with a strange intensity. In his right hand, he clutched something small and metallic, the glint of it catching her eye. It was the keychain, the one with the engraved initials E.M. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "Mom," the man said, his voice low, rough, as if the word itself hadn't passed his lips in years. For a moment she could only stare, the rain pattering against the porch roof, the sound loud in her ears. The years between them seemed to collapse all at once. His hair was longer, his frame taller, but there was no mistaking the curve of his jaw, the way his brows furrowed slightly when he looked at her. "Ethan," she whispered. He gave the smallest nod. The keychain glinted again as his fingers tightened around it. Margaret's knees felt weak. She gripped the edge of the doorframe to steady herself. 1,000 questions burned through her. Where had he been? How had he found his way back? Who had he been with? But before she could speak again, Ethan's gaze shifted past her into the dark hallway of the house. His expression changed, something like caution flickering in his eyes. He took a small step back, glancing over his shoulder into the rain-soaked street, as if making sure he hadn't been followed. "We can't talk here," he said quietly. "It's not safe." The words chilled her more than the November air ever could. Before she could respond, headlights swept across the street, briefly illuminating the front of the house. Ethan stiffened, his grip on the keychain tightening, until his knuckles turned white. The vehicle slowed, then rolled past without stopping. Margaret felt the weight of 14 years pressing down on her. Yet, in that moment, she knew whatever had happened to her son, whatever had kept him away all these years, was still out there. Watching. She swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "Then tell me where." Ethan's eyes locked on hers, rainwater running down his face, and in the dim porch light she thought she saw fear. "Tomorrow," he said. "Same time, but not here." And just like that, he turned and walked down the steps, his boots splashing in the shallow puddles on the sidewalk. She watched him disappear into the mist, the sound of his footsteps fading into the steady rhythm of the rain. Margaret stood there long after he was gone, the keychain's image burned into her mind, the echo of his voice still in her ears. For the first time in 14 years, she had hope. And for the first time in just as long, she was truly afraid. When Ethan Miller was 13, he had been the kind of boy who blended into the background, without meaning to. He wasn't shy, exactly, but he had a habit of watching people more than talking to them, as if he could learn more by noticing what they didn't say. Teachers remembered him for his quiet determination. Classmates remembered him for the sketchbook he carried everywhere, filled with half-finished drawings of places that didn't quite exist. Before the day he vanished, Ethan's world had been small but familiar. The modest Miller home on Alder Street, the walk to school along the cracked sidewalk lined with moss-covered fences, the corner store where he'd buy a root beer after soccer practice. Margaret, his mother, worked long hours at Providence Medical Center. She'd come home tired, her scrubs smelling faintly of antiseptic and coffee, but she always made time to check Ethan's homework and listen to his rambling stories about science projects or the latest comic book he'd read. She was his anchor, steady, predictable, someone he believed would always be there. Daniel, his father, was different. A mechanic by trade, his hands were always stained with oil, his fingernails permanently dark from years of work. He wasn't as talkative as Margaret, but his quiet pride in Ethan showed in smaller ways, a hand on the shoulder when Ethan fixed something himself, a nod of approval when he scored a goal the day he handed him the small metal keychain with EM engraved on it. "You'll always know where home is," Daniel had said that morning. That keychain would become the last thing Ethan remembered holding before everything went dark. The years after his disappearance would become a blur for Ethan. 14 years compressed into fragments, bits of conversations, smells, fleeting images. He remembered a long drive through forests, the sound of gravel under tires. He remembered waking up in a small bedroom with pale yellow walls and a window that looked out onto a yard he didn't recognize. There had been a woman there, kind in some ways, strict in others. She'd told him her name was Anna, and that she was a friend of the family. "Want But no matter how many times he asked about his parents, she'd say the same thing: they can't be here right now. For years, Ethan had tried to piece together the truth, but every time he got close, Anna would change the subject, or someone else in the house would step in. He'd gone to school under a different name, lived in a different state. And slowly, the memories of Portland had started to fade, except for the maple tree, the kitchen window, and the keychain he kept hidden in a drawer. Back in Portland now, standing in his old neighborhood, Ethan felt like he was walking through a dream. The houses were the same, but older, their paint faded, lawns overgrown. The corner store had closed, replaced by a coffee shop with a neon sign that flickered in the rain. Margaret had aged, of course, more lines around her eyes, more silver in her hair. But her voice, her way of saying his name, was exactly as he remembered, and that made it harder. Because the part of him that had learned to survive by keeping secrets was now fighting the part that wanted to tell her everything. Ethan's return hadn't been planned. The opportunity had appeared suddenly, a moment when he realized no one was watching him, when the road back to Portland was clear. But now that he was here, he wasn't sure if he'd brought danger with him. He thought about the car that slowed in front of the house last night. The way the headlights lingered just a second too long. He had spent years learning to notice small details, to read the room before walking into it. That instinct had kept him alive. And now it told him that the past wasn't done with him. Margaret spent most of the next day in a daze. She went through the motions at work, her mind looping over Ethan's face, the way his voice had sounded when he said Mom. She wanted to believe he was safe now, that the nightmare was over. But his warning, "It's not safe," echoed in her mind like a cold wind slipping under the door. When she came home that evening, she went into the attic, pulling down an old box marked Ethan. Inside were his school notebooks, soccer trophies, a faded hoodie, and photographs from birthdays and Christmases. She held each item as if it might connect her to him, as if it could explain the gap between then and now. At the bottom of the box was a folded piece of paper she didn't remember. She opened it slowly. It was a crude map, a few streets drawn in pencil, with an X marked near the river. Her pulse quickened. She didn't know if Ethan had drawn it before he vanished, or if someone else had put it there after. That night, Ethan sat in the corner booth of a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of the city. His hood was up, a half-empty cup of coffee cooling in front of him. He kept his back to the wall, eyes on the door. Every time it opened, the chime above it made him tense. He pulled the keychain from his pocket, running his thumb over the engraved letters. In his mind, he was 13 again, hearing his father's voice. But the memory was always cut short, replaced by another voice, lower, telling him not to ask questions he didn't want the answers to. A waitress stopped at his table, refilling his coffee. "Cold night to be out," she said casually. Ethan gave her a faint smile. "I'm waiting for someone." "Hope they show," she said, moving on. He glanced at the clock. If Margaret came tonight, if she was willing to meet him away from the house, maybe they could talk freely. But he also knew that whoever had been in that car might be looking for him, and if they found him before he explained everything. Margaret left the house just after 10, the folded map in her coat pocket. She didn't know why she'd brought it, maybe to ask Ethan if he recognized it, maybe to confirm it was nothing. The rain had eased into a light mist, but the street still glistened under the streetlights. As she drove toward the diner, a dark SUV pulled out from a side street 2 blocks behind her. She noticed it in the rearview mirror, its headlights unwavering. She told herself it was just coincidence. But when she changed lanes, so did the SUV. She didn't know it yet, but that moment, the decision to keep driving, would mark the beginning of something neither she nor Ethan could turn back from. And in the diner, Ethan looked at the door one last time before the bell above it rang. The diner's door swung open, the small brass bell above it chiming once before the cold night air slipped inside. Margaret stepped through, her eyes scanning the rows of booths until they landed on the figure in the corner. Ethan looked up, his hood still casting a shadow over his face, but there was no mistaking him. He gestured for her to join him, and as she slid into the seat across from him, she felt the same disorienting rush she'd experienced on the porch the night before. 14 years of absence condensed into one impossible moment of presence. Up close, she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the thin scar that ran from his left temple toward his ear. His hands rested on the table, one curled protectively around the keychain, the other tapping lightly against the surface in a slow, uneven rhythm. "You came," he said, voice low. "You told me to," she replied. She hesitated, then added, "I wasn't followed." He looked at her for a long moment, then gave a slight shake of his head. "You might have been." Margaret frowned. "Ethan, what are you talking about? Who—" Before she could finish, the bell chimed again. A man entered, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. He didn't look at them, but as he passed by, Margaret noticed his gaze flick toward their booth for just a fraction of a second too long. Ethan's tapping stopped. He sat perfectly still, watching the man take a seat at the counter. "Do you know him?" she whispered. Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice barely above a breath. "We don't have much time." "I need to tell you something, but you can't react." Her pulse quickened. "The people who took me, they didn't just want me gone. They wanted something from Dad, and I don't think they ever got it." Margaret's mind reeled. "What do you mean, people? Who are they? What did they want?" Ethan's eyes flicked toward the man at the counter, then back to her. "I can't explain everything here, but I need you to trust me when I say you're in danger now, too." Margaret's hands tightened around the folded map in her pocket. She pulled it out and slid it across the table. "Do you know this?" Ethan unfolded it slowly. His jaw tightened. "Where did you get this?" "It was in your box, the one in the attic." He looked at her sharply. "I didn't put it there." They left the diner separately, Margaret heading toward her car, Ethan slipping into the shadows along the side street. But the SUV from earlier was back, parked across the street, engine idling. Inside, behind tinted windows, two figures sat in silence, watching. The next morning, Margaret found a note slipped under her front door. No envelope, just block letters printed on a sheet of paper. "Stop asking questions." Her stomach dropped. She looked up and down the quiet street, but there was no one outside. She called Ethan's number, the burner phone he'd given her at the diner, but it went straight to voicemail. By midday, she decided to drive out to the location marked on the map. It was a stretch of riverbank on the industrial side of the city, lined with old warehouses. The air smelled faintly of oil and damp concrete. She parked 2 blocks away and walked the rest, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Near the X on the map, she found a rusted metal door hanging slightly open. Inside, the air was colder, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed off the walls. She pulled out her phone to use the flashlight, sweeping the beam across stacks of abandoned crates and broken pallets. Then the light caught something on the floor, a scrap of fabric. It was deep blue, worn thin, with a faint embroidered patch on one side. A soccer club logo she recognized instantly. Ethan's team from the year he vanished. Her breath came faster. She knelt to pick it up. And that's when she heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, coming from deeper inside the warehouse. Margaret backed toward the door, her phone trembling in her hand. The footsteps stopped. A voice echoed from the shadows. "You shouldn't be here." She turned and ran. That night, Ethan finally called. His voice was tense. "Where were you today?" She hesitated. "I went to the place on the map." "You shouldn't have," he said sharply. "They're already watching me. Now they'll be watching you too." Who is they, Ethan? There was a pause. People who used to be close, closer than you think. Before she could press him, he added, I'll explain tomorrow, but you have to promise me, if anyone asks, you haven't seen me. Later, as Margaret tried to sleep, a faint sound woke her. Not the creak of the house settling, not the hum of the refrigerator. This was different. It was the sound of someone quietly turning the doorknob to her front door. Margaret didn't move. She lay in bed, every muscle tense, her eyes fixed on the shadowy outline of her bedroom door. The faint sound of the doorknob downstairs turning was followed by silence. She strained to hear over the pounding of her own heartbeat. Then, nothing. The old house groaned once, a soft, settling creak, and she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. But a moment later, a light beam flickered across the wall outside her bedroom, the kind that came from a flashlight. She reached into the drawer of her nightstand and wrapped her fingers around the cold metal handle of the small hammer she kept there since Daniel had died. She waited, listening. The beam of light moved away, toward the stairs, a faint click of the front door. Then only the steady rhythm of rain on the roof. Margaret stayed frozen for a long minute before creeping to the window. Down on the street she saw a figure in a dark hood step into the passenger side of a waiting SUV. It pulled away, taillights glowing red through the mist. By morning she had made up her mind. This wasn't something she could handle alone. She drove to the small precinct where Officer Linda Hayes still worked. Linda had been the first detective assigned to Ethan's case all those years ago, and Margaret knew she'd never truly let it go. When Linda saw her walk in, her expression shifted from surprise to concern. "Margaret, what's happened?" Margaret sat across from her in the cramped office and told her everything. The knock at the door, Ethan's warning, the diner meeting, the map, the warehouse, the SUV. She left nothing out, except one detail. She didn't say where Ethan was now. She couldn't risk it. Linda listened in silence, tapping a pen against a file folder. When Margaret finished, she leaned back. "If Ethan's back in Portland, and if what you're saying is true, then this isn't over. Whoever took him may still have an interest in your family." Margaret hesitated. "Linda, I think it's someone we know." The detective's eyes narrowed. That would explain why the original investigation hit dead ends. Later that afternoon, Ethan called from a payphone. "We need to meet somewhere safe. Not the diner, not your house." They agreed on a quiet public park by the river, a place Ethan remembered from before. He was already there when she arrived, leaning against the railing of the old pedestrian bridge, the hood of his jacket pulled low. She handed him a copy of the note from her door. He read it once, then folded it in half. "This isn't a warning, it's a leash. They're letting us know they're watching." Margaret studied him. "Ethan, who's they?" He hesitated, scanning the park before answering. "When I was taken, there was a man I saw often. He called himself Tom. He knew things about Dad, Osgood, things I didn't even know, said Dad owed him. At the time, I thought it was about money." "It wasn't?" Ethan shook his head. "No, it was something else. Papers, documents. He kept saying Dad had something that didn't belong to him." They decided to look through Daniel's old workshop, untouched since his death 5 years earlier. The air inside smelled faintly of motor oil and dust. Tools hung neatly on pegboards. Jars of screws lined the shelves. In the far corner, under a workbench, Margaret found an old metal toolbox she didn't recognize. Inside was a manila envelope sealed with brittle tape. She peeled it open. Inside were photocopies of deeds, property records, and a faded black-and-white photograph of Daniel standing beside a man Margaret didn't know. Behind them was a warehouse, the same one marked on the map. Ethan stared at the photograph. "That's him. That's Tom." Daniel hadn't just been a bystander in Ethan's disappearance. He had known, and once worked with, the man who took him. Margaret's voice shook. "Ethan, why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I didn't know if you'd believe me, and because there's more. I think Tom isn't working alone. I think someone else helped him, someone still close to us." As he spoke, a shadow crossed the workshop window. Margaret's breath caught. Ethan moved toward the door, but by the time he stepped outside, the street was empty. Only a scrap of paper fluttered on the porch, weighed down by a small stone. It read, "Last warning." That night, Margaret dreamed of the maple tree in the front yard, but in the dream, its branches were bare and hung with strips of blue fabric, the same color as the scrap she'd found in the warehouse. Beneath it stood Ethan, 13 again, holding out the keychain, his mouth forming words she couldn't hear. She woke to the sound of her phone buzzing. It was a message from an unknown number. "Tomorrow, midnight, warehouse. Come alone if you want answers." The warehouse was even darker at night. Margaret parked 3 blocks away, her headlights off as she rolled the last few feet into the curb. The river nearby murmured in the dark, carrying the scent of damp concrete and diesel. She had come alone, as the message instructed, but every nerve in her body told her it was a mistake. She slipped the small flashlight into her coat pocket next to the folding knife she'd taken from the kitchen drawer, the same one Daniel used to use to open boxes in the workshop. Her footsteps echoed on the cracked pavement as she approached the rusted door. It groaned when she pushed it open, the sound swallowed by the vast, cold space beyond. Inside, faint moonlight filtered through broken windows high on the walls, casting long shadows across the floor. The silence was so complete that she could hear the drip-drip of water from somewhere deep in the building. Then, from the far end, a figure stepped into view. It was Ethan. "Mom," he said quietly, "you shouldn't have come." Margaret took a step toward him. "You told me to." "I didn't send that message." The words landed like a blow. Before she could respond, another voice echoed from the shadows. "She figured it out faster than I expected." A man emerged from behind a stack of crates. He was taller than Ethan, broad-shouldered, his face lined with age and experience. Even in the dim light, Margaret recognized him from the photograph in Daniel's toolbox. Tom. Her breath caught. "You—" Tom raised a hand. "I'm not here to hurt you, Margaret, but you need to understand, your husband and I, we built something together, something valuable. And when he decided to keep it for himself, I had to find leverage." Ethan's jaw tightened. "That leverage was me." Tom didn't flinch. "It kept him quiet for years. But then he died. And I thought you might have what he took from me." Margaret shook her head. "I don't know what you're talking about." Tom stepped closer, the sound of his boots loud against the concrete. "The documents in that envelope, the property records, that warehouse. It's sitting on something worth millions. Your husband knew it, and so do I. He hid the access key somewhere, and I think Ethan knows where." Margaret turned to her son. "Ethan?" He hesitated, then pulled the keychain from his pocket. The small metal tag, engraved with his initials, caught the moonlight. "It's not just a keychain," he said. "It's a real key I found out years ago. It opens a lock under the floorboards in the far corner of this building. That's why I was never allowed near it." Tom's eyes narrowed. "Then let's not waste time." They crossed the warehouse together, Tom's presence looming behind them. Ethan knelt by the far wall, feeling for the loose plank. When he pried it up, a small metal hatch was revealed beneath. The key slid in perfectly, turning with a heavy click. Inside was a steel lockbox. Tom stepped forward, but Ethan held up a hand. "Not until you tell her the truth, all of it." Tom exhaled slowly. "Fine. The warehouse is sitting on a buried access tunnel. During the late 80s, it was used to move things without anyone knowing. Cash, goods, information. Your father was part of it. We all were. Then he found something in the tunnel, something that didn't belong to us, and instead of telling the others, he hid it. Margaret's voice was a whisper. What was it? Tom's gaze flicked to the lockbox. A ledger, names, dates, transactions, enough to ruin a lot of people, and send the right ones to prison. Ethan pulled the box free, its weight straining his arms. And you think Dad wanted to keep it? I think, Tom said. He was waiting for the right moment, but the moment never came. As Tom reached for the box, headlights suddenly swept through the broken windows, blinding them for a moment. The sound of an engine cut off, followed by multiple car doors slamming. Ethan's face went pale. They're here. 3 men entered the warehouse, all in dark jackets, their steps quick and precise. One of them carried a crowbar, another a pistol. Tom, the one with the pistol, said, "You were supposed to bring the boy, not the mother." Margaret's heart pounded. Tom stepped between her and the men. Things changed. The man with the pistol smirked. Then they change again. He raised the weapon. Ethan moved before he could think, swinging the lockbox into the man's arm. The shot went wide, ricocheting off the wall with a deafening clang. Margaret dropped to the floor, her ears ringing. Tom grabbed the pistol as it fell, shoving the man back. "Go!" he shouted at Ethan and Margaret. They ran, weaving between stacks of crates toward the rusted door. Behind them, the chaos of shouts and scuffling boots echoed in the cavernous space. Outside, the night air was sharp in their lungs. They didn't stop running until they reached Margaret's car. Ethan threw the lockbox into the back seat and climbed in after her. As they sped away, Margaret glanced at him. "What's in there really, Ethan? Is it worth all of this?" He met her gaze. "It's the truth about what happened to me, and maybe the truth about who Dad really was. Daniel was not just an innocent father. He was connected to a network that used the warehouse for illegal operations. Ethan's abduction was leveraged to recover something he'd stolen from that network. The ledger now in their possession." They didn't see the SUV that pulled onto the road behind them until its headlights flared in the rearview mirror. It began to follow. The SUV's headlights grew larger in the rearview mirror, its engine a low growl that carried over the sound of Margaret's own heartbeat. The rain had picked up again, streaking across the windshield in silver threads, wipers struggling to keep up. Ethan twisted in his seat to look behind them. They're not backing off. Margaret's grip on the wheel tightened. "We can't go home." "They already know where you live," Ethan said. His gaze shifted to the lockbox in the back seat. "We need to get this somewhere safe." A flash of memory hit him. Anna, the woman who'd raised him after he was taken, whispering once when she thought no one was listening, "If they ever find you with it, run." He hadn't understood then, but he did now. Margaret swerved suddenly, taking a sharp right into a narrow side street. The SUV followed, its tires hissing over the wet pavement. "Ethan," she said, "is there anyone you trust?" He hesitated. "Linda Hayes." Margaret nodded, flooring the gas. They reached the precinct in under 10 minutes, skidding into the back parking lot. Linda met them at the rear entrance, her expression shifting from confusion to urgency as she saw the SUV pull into the street beyond. Inside, in a small interview room, Ethan set the lockbox on the table. "It's what they've been after since I was a kid," he said. "It's proof. My dad was involved with them, but he didn't play by their rules." Linda eyed the box. "If what's in there is what you say, it could take down a lot of people." Ethan nodded. "And that's why they'll keep coming until they get it back." Linda fetched a crowbar, and together they pried the lockbox open. Inside, beneath layers of oilcloth, lay a leather-bound ledger. Its pages were filled with neat, slanted handwriting, columns of numbers and names, some familiar, some infamous. Margaret's eyes scanned the entries, her breath catching on one in particular. Hayes, L. $15,000. She looked up sharply at Linda. The detective's jaw tightened. "It's not what it looks like." But Ethan was already on his feet. "So that's why you never stopped looking for me." Linda's voice dropped. It wasn't to protect them, it was to find this. And to make sure it didn't end up in the wrong hands. Before they could process it further, the lights in the building flickered once, twice, and went out completely. The sound of boots echoed in the hallway. Margaret grabbed Ethan's arm. "They're here." Linda pulled her sidearm, motioning them toward the back exit. "Go! I'll hold them off." Ethan hesitated. "If they get you—" "I've been ready for that for a long time," Linda said. They slipped into the rain-soaked alley, the ledger wrapped in Ethan's jacket. Footsteps pounded behind them, shouts cutting through the dark. Margaret's car was parked 2 blocks away. They ran for it, lungs burning, water splashing under their shoes. As they reached it, a figure stepped out from behind a dumpster. Tom. He held no weapon, only raised his hands. "They'll kill you for that ledger," he said. "Give it to me, and I can make sure you disappear for good this time. Somewhere they'll never find you." Ethan stared at him. "You mean the way you made me disappear before?" Tom's expression didn't change. "I kept you alive." Margaret's voice was cold. "By stealing 14 years of his life." Sirens wailed in the distance, drawing closer. Tom glanced over his shoulder, then back at Ethan. "Choose now." Ethan stepped forward and handed him something wrapped in the jacket. Tom took it without checking, slipping into the shadows as the sirens grew louder. Margaret turned to him, horrified. "You gave it to him?" Ethan unzipped his own coat, revealing the real ledger inside. "I gave him my sketchbook. Let's hope he doesn't notice until it's too late." They reached the car as police units flooded the street. Margaret slid behind the wheel, Ethan clutching the ledger in his lap. The danger wasn't gone, not by a long shot, but for the first time since his return, they had the upper hand. Margaret glanced at him. "What happens now?" Ethan looked out at the rain, his voice steady. "We finish what Dad started, and we make sure no one else loses their life to these people." 2 weeks later, the rain finally stopped. Portland's streets glistened in the pale morning light, the maple trees along Alder Street dripping quietly as the clouds broke apart. Ethan stood in the front yard of the house he'd left 14 years earlier, his hands in the pockets of a new jacket, the old keychain still attached to his belt loop. The ledger had been turned over to federal investigators. Linda Hayes had made the drop herself, vanishing from sight afterward, whether for her safety or for reasons Ethan didn't want to guess at. Tom had disappeared too, though a rumor from one of Linda's contacts suggested he'd fled the country. Margaret came out onto the porch, a mug of coffee in her hands. She looked tired, but not in the same way she had before Ethan returned. This was a different kind of tired, the kind that came from fighting for something worth keeping. "They called this morning," she said. "Some of the names in the ledger. They're already facing charges, and they think the rest will follow." Ethan nodded. He'd expected as much, though the victory felt muted. "It won't bring back the years." "No," Margaret agreed softly, "but it might stop them from taking more from someone else." They stood in silence for a while, listening to the distant sounds of the city waking up. Later that afternoon, Ethan walked alone to the park by the river. He found the old pedestrian bridge and leaned against the railing, watching the water move beneath him. From his pocket, he pulled a folded page from his sketchbook, the only thing he'd kept from his years away that truly felt like his. It was a drawing of the maple tree in front of the house, done from memory years earlier. In the drawing, the tree was full of leaves, a boy sitting in its branches with a keychain dangling from one hand. He tucked the drawing back into his pocket and turned toward home. That night, Margaret found him in the kitchen, staring out the window at the maple tree. The porch light spilled across its bare branches, casting long shadows on the ground. "You know," she said quietly, "your father gave you that keychain because he wanted you to always know where home was. I think, in the end, you brought it back to us." Ethan's gaze stayed on the tree. Home's not just a place, Mom. It's the people who still open the door when you knock. She smiled faintly. You knocked. I answered. That's all that matters now. Outside, the wind moved through the branches, the sound soft and familiar. For the first time since his return, Ethan felt the knot in his chest loosen. The danger might not be entirely gone, but for now, they had each other, and sometimes that was enough. The next morning, Margaret woke to find a single scrap of blue fabric on the porch, the same kind she'd found in the warehouse. No note, no explanation. She picked it up slowly, turning it over in her hand. Then she closed the door, locked it, and walked back inside. If they were still out there, watching, they would have to wait, because this time the Miller family was ready. The same house, the same tree. But now a very different ending.